During the 3 previous centuries, Europe's landscape has been forever changed by a series of wars and diplomatic issues, not only shaping lines on a map, but the peoples and societies that live within the borders as well. From Napoleon's conquest of Europe to the border tensions of the Cold War, and the French Revolution, Franco-Prussian War, and the Second World War that fell in between, Europe was subjected to the diplomatic and wartime actions that occurred as a result of those events. On October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette, 2 weeks shy of her 38th birthday, is led from the Temple Tower to the streets of Paris. With her hair cut off and her hands bound behind her back, the young queen remains stoic and posed as she is led to her execution.
Contigo yo viviré, por ti volaré.
The moment when my ills are going to end is not the moment when courage is going to fail me.
How did a king and queen, who ruled over one of the greatest European powers, slice their lives short at the guillotine? And what led a country to one of the most bloodiest revolutions in history? Due to the spending in the 70 Years' War and the American Revolution, France was in the midst of a financial crisis. The lower class was bombarded with heavy taxes, while the nobility paid hardly any. The king called together the States General for the first time since 1614. The States General was organized into 3 estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the rest of France. Despite the first 2 estates controlling most of the power, the third estate represented 95% of the population. On the 17th of June, 1789, the third estate declared themselves the National Assembly. Due to Louis XVI ordering the closure of the Salle d'Etat, the assembly moved to a nearby tennis court, where the tennis court oath was agreed upon on the 20th of June, 1789. Soon after, most of the clergy's representatives and 47 members of the nobility joined. The messages of the support poured from cities all over France. On July 14th, the people stormed the Bastille, a fortress and a prison, and captured it within hours. Members of the nobility fled to neighboring countries as a wave of revolution swept the country. Commoners began to form militias, and paranoia and rumors spread. The Reign of Terror, a period in time in which enemies of the revolution were executed, resulted in tens of thousands of deaths from September 1793 to July 1794. On the 26th of August, 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizens was published by the Assembly, consisting of principles that was influenced directly by Thomas Jefferson. Louis XVI and his family fled the Turbulus Palace, dressed as servants, but were recognized and brought back to Paris. After put on trial, King Louis XVI was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. He was executed on January 21st, 1793. Marie Antoinette followed in his footsteps 9 months later.
I was a queen, and you took away my crown, a wife, and you killed my husband, a mother, and you deprived me of my children. My blood alone remains. Take it, but do not make me suffer long.
The French Revolution continues to stand as one of the bloodiest revolutions in history, resulting in thousands of deaths by the guillotine and the destruction of the French monarchy. Although France would put another men back on the throne, the revolution shook the ancient structure of Europe and changed France forever.
The French Revolution left for a little man a chance to make a big change to the landscape of Europe during the 18th and 19th century Europe.
Napoleon's vast empire was critical in the gradual formation of Europe as it is known today. Napoleon was instrumental in creating coalitions either against or with him, which in hindsight may have never existed without Napoleon's conquests. For instance, the Confederation of the Rhine consists of mainly German-speaking countries, which today consists mainly as what we know today as Germany. Before the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine, there was never any historical period in which these German states were unified in any manner, and therefore it can be argued that Napoleon's annexation of this territory introduced this possibility. Napoleon was vital in the early separation of church and state. This image shows Napoleon's crowning himself rather than the Pope crowning him. This was symbolic of Napoleon's belief that he was bigger than the church, as well as his wish to recreate Charlemagne's Frankish Empire. Furthermore, this was a turning point in the fall of the church itself, as it brought many questions of power, of the actual political power of the church, and caused both Napoleon's empire as well as future ones to ignore the church's ideologies when formulating political policy. This is not to say the church no longer had a prominent role, it just no longer had the same significant role in terms of politics. Napoleon's ability to organize logistics, recruit, as well as outsmart the opponents through flanks, blockades, and his great use of artillery is what so many people consider him a military genius. The void Napoleon's empire left was fulfilled by the director of Brumaire. Napoleon's military tactics were second to none during his time period, as well as his great leadership ability. Napoleon's ability to organize logistics, recruit, as well as outsmart the opponents through flanks, blockades, and his great use of artillery is what made so many people consider him a military genius.
The continuation of the French throne under the Emperor Napoleon III culminated in the single choice of entering into a war with Prussia, essentially ending the French monarchy and marking an era of a unified Germany that would dominate Europe economically and technologically into the 19th century. However, the effects of the ending of empire and the starting of another would lead to millions of deaths in the century to come.
On July 16, 1770, the Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck got his war to unify Germany when France declared war on Prussia. However, Bismarck could never predict the long-lasting effects that the war and its treaty would have on the century to come. Bismarck successfully enraged the people and government of France enough to create a sufficient cause for war, a war that the Prussians would win very decisively, as they were far more equipped and ready. Prussia's decisive victory was enabled by the industrial economy that created new railroads, new weapons, and new tactics.
As citizens of the United Kingdom, we paid little attention to the event, since editors and journalists alike seemed it would be short and unremarkable. However, as France went from one expected defeat to another, various scenes of the war started to fill the pages of periodicals, and made us question why this was happening.
The Prussian success in the war foreshadowed very closely the power of the new technological advancements that would become commonplace for all sides in the war to come. During the war, Germany used its advanced industrial economy to forge superior weapons and implement new artillery tactics. Enhanced by its military advantage, Germany was able to mirror techniques that would be prevalent throughout the two world wars of the next century.
As Prussians, the social and economic developments of the past 50 years have brought about a military and industrial revolution. We have been able to keep up with technology, and France has not. Therein lay the basic cause of her defeat. Our conquest of France led to a united Germany that naturally flourished into an industrial giant using the same technology advances that won us the war. We have began a Prussian-led German empire that swayed the balance of power to us, ending the balance of power that was created from the Congress of Vienna for the first time since Napoleon Bonaparte, almost 60 years later.
It was the fear of balance of power that the treaties of the late 19th and 20th century came about. From the war, the Kingdom of Prussia became a political, economic, and militaristic leader in Europe by reaping the benefits of leading a unified Germany's technological advancements over its neighbors. And it was the fear that developed from the belief that Germany's new power would be dangerous to the other European countries that created the rift between Germany with France and England. The Franco-Prussian War set the stage for World War I by the nature of the combatants and the technology used. The Treaty of Frankfurt that ended the conflict had an even more significant impact. It started a precedent that would dictate the treaties of the 20th century. Germany's end goal was to create a unified Germany and tip the balance of power in their favor. But instead, they created a treaty that would create two more wars, which ended with Germany divided in two, as other countries would create industrialized economies that would catch up to Germany in the following wars. Specifically, the Treaty of Frankfurt had two very key issues that caused long-term animosity between the countries. First, the newly formed German Empire set a precedent for future modernistic national wars, and it imposed extreme war indemnities on the losing side, and faced occupation until they were paid off. As France had a crippled economy due to the cost of war and had to fix the damage done internally by being invaded, this was a way that Germany could secure superiority over France for a significant amount of time. Secondly, the taking of Alsace and Lorraine from France was a ploy to wound French nationalistic pride. Both consequences of this treaty shaped Europe for the century to come, as France's vengeful attitude toward Germany impacted the treaties, as a pattern revenge set by the Treaty of Frankfurt carried on another 70 years. The diplomatic strategies of the signers of the Treaty of Versailles mirrored those of the Treaty of Frankfurt, as the victories won a war of pride and destroyed the pride of their enemy in the treaty, causing extreme embitterment.
How does the world allow for a man of psychopathic tendencies to rise to power over a regime that threatened the very idea of freedom? Adolf Hitler and his Nazi regime was one such enemy of humanity, and his beliefs led to the deaths of countless innocent people. His goal for the German people was to create a super race spanning the entire continent of Europe, redrawing the borders for the superiority of the German people. A man of intense patriotism, Hitler believed wholeheartedly in the idea of making the world into the ideal that he strived for. As the aftermath of World War I began to be tallied up by the Allied and Associate powers, the Treaty of Versailles doled out the expected reparations to be paid by the defeated Central Powers. These were payments to be made in cash or something in kind. The heaviest penalty fell on Germany because they were the main perpetrators. The amount they were expected to pay totaled 50 billion German marks, which is equivalent to 12.5 billion US dollars. The economy was even further mired as hyperinflation took hold, and by November 1923, $1 US was worth 4.2 trillion marks. This led to the quality of living in post-World War I Germany to be atrocious, and for an already prideful people, it was unacceptable to them. Hitler started his political career when he joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which would later turn into the Nazi Party. Many historians attribute the length of the war to the superior technology and discipline of the Nazi regime and its constituents. It went on for such a long duration, in large, because of Hitler's extreme dedication to his cause and his refusal to give up his end goal for Europe. It came about in two different operations, with one being the push of German forces into the USSR with the invasion of Russia in June of 1941, and then the orders to relocate the Jews in Central Europe to the concentration camps to be gassed. As the war came to a close and the Allies were closing in on Berlin on all sides and the majority of his forces captured, Hitler finally realized there was no way out.
Following Hitler's suicide and Germany's surrender, the Japanese did not last long against the combined Allies' power. The war officially ended when the unconditional surrender for the Japanese was signed on the USS Missouri. Shortly after the war, the countries of the Allies, primarily the Western powers and Russia, were feeling nervous about their former partner countries. A tension that has been growing since the war was at its midpoint. The primary cause, among other things, of such awkward feelings was the USSR deciding to change the borderlines of surrounding Eastern nations for its benefit. Simply put, Stalin's issue of trust and desire to cause socialist changes in other countries solely bred offensive Soviet militaristic actions during the Cold War. This then led to border changes in Eastern Europe.
After the conclusion of World War II, Winston Churchill made a speech expressing uneasiness concerning Russia's expansion. The President of the United States applauded and supported Churchill's words of concern. However, Stalin did not react as well to the speech. In substance, Mr. Churchill now stands in the position of a firebrand of war. And Mr. Churchill is not alone here. He has friends not only in England, but also in the United States of America. In this respect, one is reminded remarkably of Hitler and his friends. As a result of the German invasion, the Soviet Union has irreparably lost in battles with the Germans, about 7 million people. In other words, the Soviet Union has lost in men several times more than Britain and the United States together. The Soviet Union cannot forget them. One can ask, therefore, what can be surprising in the fact that the Soviet Union, in a desire to ensure its security for the future, tries to achieve that these countries should have governments whose relations to the Soviet Union are loyal? How can one, without having lost one's reason, qualify these peaceful aspirations of the Soviet Union as expansionist tendencies of our own government? Mr. Churchill wanders around the truth when he speaks of the growth of the influence of the communist parties in Eastern Europe. The growth of the influence of communism cannot be considered accidental.
According to John Lewis Gaddis, Russia's policy was a direct reflection of the priorities and practices of a single individual. Concerning Stalin's own views, he saw class struggle on a global scale as much as he did on a nationwide and local level. In addition, he regarded the capitalist countries, such as the Western powers, as an enemy in ideological principle. This meant that the Soviets in Stalin's eyes could never trust Western countries. He would not stop until the surrounding nations implemented socialism in its governments and were under Soviet military control. Only then could he spread communism efficaciously and secure Mother Russia. In as early as 1943 to 1944, Stalin began his drive for Sovietization of Eastern Europe to ensure Russia's safety and interests. Poland was a priority for Russia because it held a vitalness in Stalin's security zone, so much that he was willing to risk conflict with the Western powers over it. Furthermore, Polish resistance was increasing in strength, which had the potential to slow Stalin's plans to use Poland as he intended. At the same time, the USSR dealt with neighboring countries in Sovietization due to their close proximity to the motherland, including Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. In detail, the Soviets rigged the elections in these countries to give the Communist Party a majority, while also secretly assassinating potential rivals. Furthermore, he then went on to annex Polovia of Romania, Eastern Prussia, Carpathian Ruthenia of Czechoslovakia, and the Baltic states. Needless to say, the territory changes of the early Cold War in Europe were caused by Stalin's mistrust of Russian capitalism and his own drive to implement socialism into other countries. He had so much power that he alone influenced Russian policy. Therefore, it comes as little surprise the strain in the Russian government following his death. Stalin was an ideological individual who expressed political intent. It contrasted with, when he died, the expansion of Soviet power and the socialist system had been stopped, and tension within the USSR was approaching calamity.
From cities all over France. From September 1793 to July 1794.
Bam.
His footsteps 9 months later. I don't know.
What turbulence balance? Wait, what was the word? It's turbulent?
It's like
I thought you were trying to say
Tuileries or something. That's
I couldn't see it.
turbulence.
They should say turbulence or something.
Yeah, the turbulence balance.
But
It's Change France forever. That wasn't great, but it's gonna do.
It's good.
sad face.
Before, and he very nearly succeeded. Oh my god, ew, I just got my hand burned too. Oh.
It's really disgusting.
That's
That is over here, right?
Yeah.
How does the world allow for a man of psychopathic tendencies? Your fingers in front of the sentences. It's worth 4, holy crap, I don't know what that number is.